This segment explains how to disassemble and assemble the main shaft, fifth gear shaft, input cluster shaft, and speedometer driven gear. Except for the fifth gear shaft, most of it is very similar to the 4-speed transaxle. Ken, show us what's involved with the main shaft.
The first step is to remove the slip-fit bearing on the fourth gear end of the main shaft and label for correct reinstallation.
The rest of the components come off like the 4-speed, beginning with the fourth gear and blocker ring, snap ring, three-four synchronizer, blocker ring, and third gear, thrust washers, second gear, and its blocker ring, another snap ring, the 1-2 synchronizer, blocker ring, and finally the first gear. The bearings should only be removed if it's worn or damaged. The flip chart shows how to press the bearing from the shaft with the required tools. The 1-2 and 3-4 synchronizer assemblies are of conventional design and similar to the 4-speed. It's important to remember that when assembling, the springs must be in opposite directions, with the hook end in a common insert tab. It is possible to install the hub backwards in the sleeve. This could cause shifting problems.
To avoid this situation, make sure you align a single set of marks on the hub and on the sleeve. Ignore the double set of marks.
Main shaft reassembly is a straightforward reversal of the disassembly procedure. Exercise care not to move the synchronizer sleeves too far, otherwise the inserts may pop out and jam the synchronizer. And of course, the final step is to install the slip-fit bearing. Ken, let's discuss the fifth gear shaft next, since it's all new for the 5-speed transaxle. Disassembly is very simple. First, remove the slip-fit bearing, making sure you label it for correct identification at installation. Lift off the fifth gear and its blocker ring. Then, remove the fifth gear synchronizer assembly. The bearing that is pressed on should only be removed if it is worn or damaged. The flip chart shows how to press the bearing from the shaft. The same tools are used as with the main shaft bearing. The fifth gear synchronizer assembly features a snap ring. A plastic insert retainer, 2 synchronizer springs, three hub inserts, a hub, and a sleeve. The synchronizer only goes together one way. Align the marks on the sleeve and hub and slide together. Install the 3 hub inserts. Now, install the 2 synchronizer springs. Be sure to position the springs in opposite directions with the hooks in a common insert. Install the plastic insert retainer with the lug in the up position. Next, install the snap ring retainer. The 3 ears fit into the insert tab and the opening around the lug at the plastic insert. To reassemble the 5th gear shaft, first install the 5th gear synchronizer assembly with the plastic insert facing the pinion gear, blocker ring, 5th gear, then the slip-fit bearing on the end of the shaft. This is the input cluster shaft assembly. The only service possible is the removal and replacement of the bearing. It's pressed off and on just like the 4-speed, so we won't cover it here. Full details are shown in your flip chart. The speedometer-driven gear for the 4 and 5-speed are identical, and so is service. Simply remove the small O-ring and slide the gear from the retainer. The large O-ring seal should also be worked from its groove. To assemble, reverse the procedure. Full details are shown in your flip chart. That about ends this segment, but first, it's time to see what you've learned. This segment covers the main shift control shaft assembly and the differential. This 5-speed main shift control shaft is very similar to the 4-speed assembly. We're going to cover it because it comes apart and goes together somewhat like a Rubik's Cube. So only disassemble it if necessary. Show us how it's done, Ken. First, rotate the 3/4 shift fork until the notch in the fork arm is over the interlock sleeve. Next, rotate the 1/2 shift fork until the notch in the fork arm is over the finger of the select arm. Now, slide the 3/4 shift fork and interlock sleeve from the shift control shaft. To complete the disassembly, drive the pin from the selector arm, being careful to support the shaft to prevent it from bending. Then, slide the selector arm and 1/2 shift fork from the control shaft. To reassemble, first install the selector arm and 1/2 fork onto the control arm. Align the hole in the selector arm with the hole in the shaft. The finger on the selector arm must be in line with the oil relief flats on the detent notches. With the shaft supported to prevent bending, install the retaining pin.
I'd like to warn you that the interlock sleeve can be installed backwards, and that you will not realize this until assembly when the interlock sleeve retaining pin interferes with the interlock sleeve.
To assure proper installation, follow this procedure. In the right hand, position the slot in the 3/4 fork over the interlock sleeve, with the flat on the sleeve facing away from you. In the left hand, position the slot in the 1/2 fork over the selector arm finger. Now, slide the 3/4 fork and interlock sleeve onto the control shaft, aligning the slot in the interlock sleeve with the finger on the selector arm. Finally, slide the 3/4 fork into position. When assembled, the forks should be aligned with the finger on the selector arm. This is the new 5-speed differential assembly. Segment 1 briefly described the difference between it and the 4-speed differential and recapped how to disassemble the 4-speed design. The 5-speed differential uses a 2-piece aluminum case, which is retained by rivets that also retain the final drive gear. Thus, all new overhaul procedures are required. We only have time here to explain how to separate the differential case. To service the differential, the case must be separated. To do this, rivets must first be drilled out. Complete details of these disassembled procedures, as well as assembly procedures, are illustrated in the flip chart. When assembling the final drive gear to the differential case, special service bolts and nuts are required to provide proper clearance. The head of the bolt must be against the differential case, and the nut against the final drive gear. That's all there is to the shifter mechanism and the differential. Now, let's see if you can get it in gear and answer these questions. This final segment shows how to assemble the transaxle, beginning with a word on differential preload bearing shimming. We won't cover it in detail since it's just like the 4-speed procedure. The spacing of the bolt holes requires this height gauge spacer to be modified a little. When placed over the dowel in the case, the holes in the spacer do not line up with the holes in the case. Therefore, the dowel pin must be driven from the spacer. The bolts can then be installed through the spacer to maintain it in position. Of course, the differential and transmission case is installed to check shim thickness, as explained in your flip chart. Once the proper shim has been determined, it should be lightly greased, as should the bearing cup and its bore in the transmission case. The shim and bearing cup are then pressed into place as described in the flip chart. Next, the speedo gear retainer is installed and retained with the screw. And then a 1 1/4 inch socket and soft hammer are used to install the input cluster shaft seal in the clutch housing. Next, the funnels are greased with petroleum jelly and installed in the clutch housing. Be sure they are bottomed in their bores. Then install the 3 bearing cups as tagged during disassembly. Similarly, the preload shims and cups should be greased and installed in the transmission case. Next, the input shift shaft oil seal is lubricated and installed, as described in the flip chart. The input shift shaft detent spring and plunger are installed in their bore. And a small drift used to depress the plunger while sliding the input shaft into its bore. Note that the notches face downward. Position the selector plate arm and slide the shift shaft through it until the hole in the arm is aligned with the hole in the shaft. Install the roll pin to retain the shift shaft and selector arm. And then slip the boot over the shift shaft. The next parts to be installed are the control selector plate, install reverse relay lever and backup lamp switch, as shown in the flip chart. You are now ready to install the differential into the clutch housing. Next, carefully install the fifth gear shaft and fork assembly, being careful not to damage the fifth gear shaft funnel. Install the main shift control shaft assembly, input cluster shaft and main shaft as a unit, being sure that the gears are in mesh.
I'd like to warn you not to damage the input shaft oil seal or main shaft funnel when lowering the shafts.
Right, Ken. Next, install the shift lever and 3/4 bias spring in their working positions. With the shift lever shaft partially in its bore. Now, install the fifth reverse spring and ball into the hole in the shift lever. Then slide the shift lever shaft with the notches down through the shift lever while depressing the ball with a drift. Finally, tap the shift shaft completely into its bore in the case. Align the hole in the shaft with the hole in the case and install the roll pin. Tap down until slightly below the surface of the case. Check to see that the selector pin is in the neutral gate of the control selector plate, and the finger of the fork selector arm is partially engaged with the 1-2 fork and the 3-4 fork. Next, the reverse idler shaft and gear are installed. And the magnet placed in its pocket. The 5th gear relay lever is installed on the reverse idler shaft and aligned with the 5th gear fork and interlock sleeve. Then install the C-clip retainer. The rest of the assembly procedure is similar to the 4-speed. Apply anaerobic sealer to the clutch housing.
Be sure to use anaerobic sealer. Do not use RTV. The silicone will clog up the oil passages.
And then install the detent spring and plunger. Next, lower the transmission case onto the clutch housing while depressing the detent spring and plunger. Apply pipe sealant with Teflon to the threads of the fork interlock sleeve retaining pin. Using a drift, align the slot in the sleeve with the hole in the case. Install the fork interlock sleeve retaining pin. Install the 15 transmission case to clutch housing bolts and torque to 13 to 17 foot-pounds. With a drift, align the reverse idler shaft hole with the hole in the case and install the reverse idler shaft retaining bolt. Apply pipe sealant with Teflon to the threads of the detent plunger retainer screw and install. Then install the differential seal into the bore of the transmission case, then the clutch housing case. Finally, place the transaxle upright and check out the operation of the gears in all shift positions. Now the transaxle is ready to be installed in the car. And let's try one more quiz.